What's up, everybody? Today I'm going to kind of go through the process of, I guess, the images that I take. I'm going to kind of show you what my thought process is before I take them and how that plays into the post-production side of things. And I guess I'll go a little bit into like my philosophy about post-production, my overall game plans. I'm not going to get into anything too specific. Like, this is not going to be a tutorial about like how to heal or clone somebody's face, how to composite stuff. I'll show you the results of what I do, but maybe for another tutorial, I might consider getting more specific. But for now, I kind of want to focus more on the idea behind an image, from conception to shooting it to processing it. And I have a couple of images that we're going to go through, such as this, a headshot that I did. This is actually for a realtor, and I guess I'll start with the purpose of these photos. This isn't all the photos that I did for the shoot, but the idea was. But I feel like these are the ones that could probably provide the most value as far as learning. So the purpose was present this realtor as kind of like an active authority in his neighborhood, an active authority in Brickell, and wanted to make him approachable and warm, friendly, but also kind of like a man about town, a man who knows his neighborhood, and not just sells real estate, but actually lives and plays, I guess, in the area. So I think I'm gonna start with this image, and I'll make a couple of corresponding videos with the other images. So first thing I'm gonna do is kind of click all the First thing I'm going to do is click all the relevant images for this, and we're going to go through them. This is right here. This is the final outcome. This is where we started. I believe it's this one. Yeah, this is it's this one. This is the raw file straight out of camera, and as you can see, it's well, it's not a bad image, but couple of things that stand out right away is that in order to get a relatively decent exposure on him, almost everything is blown out. Every highlight, the view is completely non-existent. This is a luxury unit at Brickell City Center in Miami, so you kind of want to show a little bit of the view. And I actually shot this with a flash, with one of my Einsteins. You can see it in this photo. You can actually see the reflection of it right here. I used a 47-inch soft lighter, which is my modifier of choice when I'm on the go, because it's so easy to set up. It's quick, it's portable, it's light, and it's only like $100. So if it breaks, shit happens to it. It's not too much of a loss. And what I wanted to do was capture a proper exposure, but I didn't want it to look like it was flash. Like, if you can see, the final result is this kind of like, oh, that's not it. What is it? Right here. The final result is a kind of like airy, light, natural lit look. I probably could have gotten a similar photo without the flash, but in order to do so, in order to get that exposure on him properly, I think I would have probably blown out. I would have probably blown this out, because like right now this exposure is with flash, and I kind of wanted to mimic the light coming in from the window. As you can see, it kind of like just kind of graces over him from the side. If I had shot this naturally, it probably would have probably blown everything here beyond recovery. And also with flash, you get more accurate colors because as light kind of travels throughout a scene, it tends to reflect and pick up on the colors in the scene. So this specific image is a very muted kind of pastel color scheme. The sofa is like this muted brown, very desaturated. The walls are white, so it probably wouldn't have been an issue. But flash also keeps the image sharper. So as you can see right here, this was shot with a shutter speed of 1/20th of a second. The camera was on a tripod. I shot it with the trigger. I'll tell you why in a sec. And had I shot this at such a low shutter speed without flash, the image might have picked up like any slight bobble in his head, and it wouldn't have been as sharp and as crisp. The reason I shot it with such a low shutter speed to begin with is because I wanted to capture some motion blur as he flipped the page through this photo book here, and I wouldn't have been able to do that if I shot at a higher shutter speed. So the flash kind of helped me counteract the motion blur and kind of keep it to just where I wanted it. As you can see, he's still in focus, and everything's kind of sharp otherwise. And also, the flash did another thing. By using it, I wouldn't have had to expose as high of an exposure as I would have in camera, and I was able to keep some detail outside. So if I wanted to, like, I could bring some of it back, as you can see. Just bringing on the highlights. Now, I knew that in the final image, I didn't want such a washed out background. So what I did was I took a couple of ambient frames. Well, I should say I tried to take a couple of ambient frames here. I actually had quite a bit of a brain fart on set and forgot to remove the flash from where it was. Maybe I just got distracted, and that actually became a problem for me because I wanted to do some exposure blending with the reflection in the mirror behind him, and I wasn't able to because because I had this reflection in every shot and there was nothing to mask in or out. But I think it still worked out pretty well because when I'm retouching anyway, when I'm processing a photo, I like to remove distractions, and this kind of like is a neutral. This area right here is kind of neutral, like you're not really looking at it. It's neither here nor there, so it doesn't really distract in any way. So I'm okay with it. It's not too bad. So let's get to the processing. This is, as I said, the raw file straight. Well, this is the raw file straight out of camera, and this is what it looked like after a couple of basic corrections in Lightroom. I just brought up the shadows a bit. I brought the highlights down. I brought up the exposure. I didn't want to lose too many details in the highlights. This is supposed to be a bright, airy scene. I'm not trying to completely bring back the view outside. This is probably what it looked like properly exposed outside. That's not really what I'm trying to get, because then it would kind of look a little too fake, a little too HDR-y. That's not really what I'm looking for either, especially because it was such a bright summer day in Florida. Nobody realistically expects to see that clear of a view. So I think I also adjusted the white balance. Yeah, I did that. I probably just sampled from like the walls just to get rid of some of the green. There was like a bit of a green tint. And let me see. Yeah, I used Adobe Standard. I shot this on a Fuji X-T2, and sometimes what I like to do is actually play around with the camera calibration profiles that Fuji provides. But for this case, I think I just left it at Adobe Standard because I wanted a less refined, more desaturated, flat image to start with. And I don't think I made any local adjustments. No, I did not. Did I? Negative. Okay, so let's just jump into Photoshop. And we'll start with this image here. And this is where we left off in Lightroom. And right away, let's see what the first thing we did was. The first thing I did was kind of blend the different exposures that we took, as I told you, like so. Like these are the exposures I took to try to just kind of like bring down the highlights a bit. And one other thing I should mention too is that one of the reasons why I shot with such a high shutter speed to begin with as well is because, as you can see here, without the natural ambient light acting as sort of like a fill light, you get a very contrasty, a very flash looking image. You can see by the shadow here. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's okay for some images. If it's obviously shot with flash, I like it just fine. For this image, I really wanted to hide the illusion that I used the flash. I really wanted to make it look naturally lit. So by shooting with a higher shutter speed, you kind of like dim down those shadows a bit. As you can see here, his shadow got a lot softer because we're using the natural light to kind of fill in those shadows. Okay, so back to the edit in Photoshop. The first thing I did was I brought back some of that exposure outside, and I did that. You can kind of see the mask that I used. I just took the this layer right here, and I actually put it in luminosity blend mode. And what that does is kind of preserves the colors of your original layer, but lets you blend in the exposures. You're gonna notice that I use blend modes a lot for different things. So I don't even think I did any complicated masking here. I think I just, with a soft brush, I just painted in like very subtly about the areas that I wanted to bring down a bit. And this was kind of like a first layer, a first go at it. And then I brought in even more of that exposure with another layer. And once again, as you can see from this mask, I just kind of like brought it in where I wanted it. And as you can see, I didn't focus anything on him, but I wanted to get, like, you know, detail back in this book and the ornaments on the table, obviously outdoors. And then I think with this layer, this is where I brought back more of the view. Not too much, but just enough. And for this, I actually used a luminosity mask. And what I mean by that is I went to my channels layer and I created mask specifically targeting different luminosities in the image. So my highlights, my super highlights, shadows, etc. And you can kind of see all those masks here. These are all highlight masks, and as you can tell, the wide areas are what will be showing in the mask. The black areas are what are hidden, and as you can see, the black areas are like the darker parts of the image. There aren't really any true darks in this image. And what this allows me to do is really target my adjustments so that I only affect the areas of the image that I want. And it's just kind of a way of controlling things in Photoshop a bit. So I did that first here, and I'll show you what it looks like without the mask. Once I brought in that mask, this is what it looks like with my highlights mask in place. As you can see, there's, like, you know, transparencies there from the mask below it. And then what I did was I put it in a group, as you can see right here, and I put an inverted black mask there, and then I just painted the areas that I wanted affected, essentially creating the effect I wanted. And as you can see, the view is there, it's preserved, but it's not in your face. It doesn't dominate the image, and it's just there enough to see that there's water and skyscrapers behind them, but it's not too distracting. And then I believe I did a hue saturation adjustment, and if I remember correctly, it was to get rid of the blues in the image, or the cyans. Yeah, cyans and blues. I completely erased some of them around the table just to these windows tend to have very bluish tints to them, which can affect the light coming through them. and I wanted to have cleaner shadows. So as you can see from this mask, I got rid of the blues up and around him. The next thing I did is I brought back some detail in the window behind him, just enough so that it's not too bright. As you can see, it's kind of blown out there. Again, using the layers from before. And then, well, I'm really not sure what I did with this blank layer. It doesn't look, I'm sure I did something, there it is. So as you can see here, oh, it's too close. I just got rid of this little dark area. When you're retouching human skin, on a photo like this, you don't have to be too precise. You can be a little quick and dirty with it, because the texture is not very detailed from this far away, and nobody's ever gonna look at this image like at 400%, and if they do, they have other issues. So I just went with the cloning, with the quick healing brush tool, and just sapped that really quick. And then I did a frequency separation layer at a very low blur, and all I did was I did that to get rid of the shine a bit on his nose. I'll show you right now. Yeah, just to get kind of like rid of that distracting shine on his nose. It was kind of bothering me. And to do that, you do your frequency separation and you paint on the color layer, and all you just do is sample colors from the area around him and you brush it in. Not too complicated. And then this layer was, well, so another one of those layers that I probably did something very minor to, and can't remember what it was. And finally, here we have our dodging and burning, and this is probably the most critical step whenever you're retouching people's faces. And you can see here that all I did was create a curves layer for the burn, just bring that curves layer down. Another one, the opposite, bring it up for the dodge. And then what I like to do is add a color layer and fill it with black, and that creates this kind of black and white overlay on the image. And you shouldn't just use any black and white overlay. Like, I wouldn't recommend using like the black and white filter in Photoshop or anything like that. Don't desaturate the image. Use this specific method, in my opinion, just because it really gives a proper representation about what the areas of the face or any texture you want to retouch, which one should be dark and which one should be bright. And in an image like this, it can actually be kind of hard even with this technique. So what I like to do is just bring in a curves layer. Don't do anything to it. Don't make any adjustments. Just bring in a curves layer and set it to the multiply blend mode. I lower the opacity to like 25%, but as you can see, it creates this like crunchy, contrasty black and white image at 100%. And that just kind of further helps me determine what should be dodged and what should be burned. And we're just going to go ahead and get rid of those black and white layers. And as you can see, pardon how slow my computer is right now. What I did was I'm just going to actually make a new layer really quick and just kind of show you what I did. I fixed the rough transitions. Oh, forgot to, there we go. I took care of these. Huh, why is it my pen painting anything? Oh, it's because this layer is not active. Oops, sorry about that. Just erase that and we'll start over. So, I Wanted to get rid of these transitions. Well, smooth out these transitions. You never want to get rid of anything completely. And I wanted to, I'll show you I wanted to soften the shadow on his nose from the flash. And I wanted to, let's see, let's get rid of those so we can sample again. And just overall smooth out and even the tone of his skin. And when you're doing that, I personally like to use a brush at a very, very low flow. I set my opacity to 100%, and I use a Wacom tablet, and I use a flow of 1% because I want my changes to be gradual and to build up. It's very easy to overdo things, and you can always scale it back to taste. You can always mask it out, or you can lower the opacity. But I find that even 1% can be pretty intense sometimes, so I prefer to have a light touch when I'm retouching. Let me just get rid of that, and here we are. Finally, I added another hue saturation there. I don't remember what this one was for. Let's back up a bit. It was to get rid of more of the blues, and this was... this is my contouring stage. So again, I did the same thing I did before, dodge and burn with color layer set to black. And this time the idea was to kind of add definition to his face, because I feel like I flattened it out a bit with the previous dodge and burn. So as you can see, I just added a little contrast. I made dark areas in his face a little bit darker, the beard, forehead, and what this does is it adds depth to a person's face. Girls do it all the time when they apply makeup. It's the same concept. And this is what I did for dodging. I wanted to illuminate the side of his face that would naturally have more light hitting it. And with this method, you never want to enhance, brighten, or dark things that are counterintuitive to the lighting in the scene. So you never want to, for example, brighten his cheekbone here to match the luminance from this side of his face, because that would just kind of be unrealistic. And let me just get rid of that. And finally, we're kind of like at the end of what I call the base of my image. It's when I make all my blends, my corrections, and then we move on to the more creative part of the image, which is usually adjustments for color grading, any type of extra lighting that I want to add to the scene. I think for this, I just added some color grades. For this, I added some color adjustments, excuse me. And it's pretty simple. I'll just start from the beginning. I added a vibrance layer where I just desaturated the image just a bit. I masked out the portion of the book here that's red, just to preserve that little splotch of color. And then what I did was I used a gradient map set to 14%. And a gradient map is, well, I'll just show you what it is. If you go to your gradient editor in Photoshop and you click on this little wheel down here and you select photographic toning, you get this selection of gradients with different colors and options. Here, I'll actually show you what they look like on a new layer. I'll just create a new gradient map about this one so you can kind of see. And that's actually what it looks like in a normal blend mode. It's actually sampling from my previous color red. So I'm just going to select one of the default Photoshop gradients. You can make your own gradients. I personally, though, find that the ones that Photoshop comes with are usually good enough for what I need. And what I use this for is as a base, almost like a lookup table for those of you coming from a color grading background in video. It's just kind of like a base to start your overall grade with. Like, do you want it to be cooler? Do you want it to be warmer? What kind of colors do you want to bring into the scene? And by themselves, obviously this looks terrible, but when you, let's just say, click here for a sec, when you bring in a different blend mode, you get a very, well, I think a very cool effect. And depending on the blend mode that you pick, you'll get a different effect, different intensities. If you want to just pick color, it'll just keep the colors, and then various forms of contrast depending on if you pick soft light or overlay. I personally always use soft light, and I always bring that opacity down because then it just looks really too much. So for this case, like 35% actually looks pretty good for this particular one. Damn, I'm actually kind of wishing I used this one instead of the one I picked. Oh, damn, what's this grade? This was, just so I know for next time, this was gold 1. Okay. Huh. So, let me just, for future reference, remember that. Let me type that into this layer. This is the original gradient that I used at full percent. It's kind of like a desaturated, focuses more on the luminance values, doesn't really do much to the color, just adds a lot of contrast. I was going for a warm, inviting image anyway, so the next step I did was a selective color adjustment, and what that does is, in this particular case, it allowed me to get rid of the magentas. When I do these, my color palette in general for images like these tends to err on the preference of browns, warm browns, and some like dark blues in the shadows. I don't particularly care for magentas that much, at least not in scenes with people. So for this image, I went to my reds channel and I actually brought down the magentas of the scene. See, you can see on his face that effect that has. It just kind of brings it down a bit. I set that to 9%, brought up the yellows a bit to like add some saturation back, and then I also bumped the cyan a bit to remove more of those reds. And then I went to my yellows and I really brought down the magentas. I actually think I might have done it too much, so I'm gonna actually bring some of those back and actually lowered the yellows on the yellows channel because I felt like it was getting a little too green. I didn't want his skin to look ghoulish either. So that actually brought back some blue into his skin. I'll just leave it at that. And then I made a color balance layer, and this kind of just didn't really do much in this case. I just wanted to introduce some blues back into the scene because I felt like all the greens and browns were becoming a little too dominant from the previous adjustment. And then finally I did sort of like my color contrast layer, and I'll show you what that does in a second. I always start with my reds, and in this case I just brought up the reds significantly just to get rid of some of those blues. Actually, I think I've done it a little too much, and that significantly warms the image up, but it introduces a lot of red. So I go to my greens channel and I bring up the green in his skin tone and bring it down in the shadows because I don't want the shadows to get too green, as you can see, just like around his neck and around his pants. And then I go to my blues channel and I do the same thing. I bump up the yellow and the highlights. I bring some blues into the shadows. I don't really introduce blues into the shadows so much as I prevent the yellows from getting there. As you can see here, I kind of pinned it right on the line. And the final step is sharpening. And when you're sharpening people, it's always important to be selective because you don't want crispy skin. And especially in this case, I shot this with the Fuji 35mm f2, which is a very sharp lens in its own right. So I've noticed that with my Fuji prime lenses in general, I don't need to add too much sharpening overall to an image because these lenses are like razors on their own. But there were some adjustments I wanted to do, and to sharpen, I basically use, I go to my filters and I go to high pass, and I stick to 2.4 because my camera sensor is 24 megapixels, and I just like the radius. I like what that radius does for this particular sensor, but you would adjust it to your taste. Like you don't have to use this particular number. And then I set my blend mode to overlay. And usually I'll stick between overlay and soft light. The difference is that it affects the intensity of the sharpening. Hard light is like the most intense. Soft light is, as you can tell, the softest, and overlay is kind of like in the middle. In this case, I stuck to overlay, and as you can see from this mask, I just sharpened certain details. Like I sharpened his beard. I didn't really touch too much of his skin, but I did a little bit on his cheek here, on the areas on his nose, on his hair, on his eyebrows and his eyes, and I brought some sharpening into his clothes, into the book that he's reading, the watch, the shoes, and the table and the ornaments here. And that pretty much covers it for this image. After that, we save it and we go back into Lightroom. And I made some more adjustments. This is what the image outside of Photoshop looks like. This is what it looks like after. And let me just close here and hit don't save. This is our final image, and once we go back into the Lightroom, I make a couple of final adjustments to taste. I usually take a break about 5 minutes to keep my eyes away from the screen to let them adjust and see if I went too far with anything. In this case, I brought back some blues, and I brought even more green into the scene because I still felt it was a little too magenta-y, probably from all the red I brought in the color contrast layer. And actually, I think there's a little too much green, so I'm gonna maybe bring that down a bit. And I like where the blues are. Yeah, let's leave the blues where they are. Then I take my whites, and I just kind of wanted to bring back more brightness into this image. So without blowing anything out, I just set my white levels up, and you know, it doesn't matter if things out here get a little blown out because it's bright outside. And I added just a touch of clarity. I always recommend when you're using clarity on people to keep it under 10, just because it gets a little too gnarly after. It's okay if you want to selectively put it or selectively use it on textures and things like that, but again, I would always err on the side of caution. I brought up the saturation and the vibrance a bit just because I felt like all the work we did in Photoshop kind of dulled the skin tones a bit, and I wanted to preserve that. And you can see I brought up the orange color scheme a bit in saturation because I wanted to affect his face. I actually think I might have overdone it on the saturation, so I'm gonna maybe lower that a bit. And let's see if I made any local adjustments. Nope. That is our final image. So just to go back and forth, that wasn't it. It's this one. This is where we started, and this is where we are now. And that concludes this tutorial. That is the thought process behind my images. I hope you got something out of this. I hope you learned something and I was able to help. If you have any questions or any comments, feel free to leave them below. And if you like what you saw, like what you heard, please subscribe. I really appreciate it. I will see you guys next time.